Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, March 17th, 2023. Our Chairman's Report this week is written by John Linder. Now, John was the original sponsor and proponent of the FAIRtax and led the fight to keep the bill before Congress. He is extremely gratified that the House has agreed to submit the FAIRtax to an up or down vote this session. John is also starting a Substack to enhance his ability to comment on the FAIRtax and other issues of importance. There's no charge to join, and John invites you all to do so. Here's John's article. The FAIRtax versus the flat tax. Speaker Kevin McCarthy has promised to vote on the FAIRtax. Immediately, some have called instead for the vote to be on the flat tax. This debate's been going on for nearly 30 years now as to whether the current confusing tax code should be replaced with a flat tax on income or a tax on consumption. Representative Dick Armey of Texas wrote a book about the flat tax, and Steve Forbes ran for president on it. I, too, once supported the flat tax, but came to realize that a tax on business could not be a flat tax on revenue. We could only tax profits, not sales. We could not tax sales because while the gross margin for software may be over 50%, the gross margin for groceries is less than 3%. We would still require a huge federal agency to audit how you arrive at a taxable profit from gross sales. That would then become subject to refinement from future Congresses. I concluded early on that the only reform of the tax code that will be lasting is to repeal it, and therefore I introduced the FAIRtax. The tax we have today, that you've come to know and love, is a flat tax on income 110 years later. It was flattened out again in 1986, only to have been amended tens of thousands of times since then. It can be flattened every year, and we'll still need a huge federal agency to audit how you arrive at taxable income from gross sales. As long as Congress knows how much you make and how you make it, they're going to find a way to get the rest. Under the FAIRtax, no one will know any details about your personal finances or earnings. The Mercator Center at George Mason University estimated 10 years ago the hidden economic costs of complying with the code and record keeping was all about $500 billion each year. Now today, it's close to twice that. An earlier study concluded that it cost a typical small business $724 to collect, comply, and remit $100. Now that's not just inefficient, that's stupid. Our tax code has created an underground economy of $3 trillion a year and keeps in excess of about $32 trillion in offshore financial centers. This money wants to be in our economy, but it's offshore because of the tax consequences of repatriation. I once asked Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan how long it would take for that offshore money to be returned to our markets and our banks if we passed the FAIRtax. He said months. Now, why do we not want that money in our markets and our banks? Today, upwards of 20% of what you currently spend at retail represents the embedded cost of the IRS. You are paying the income tax costs and the payroll tax costs and the accountants and the attorneys to avoid those tax costs for each of the thousands of companies it takes to get a loaf of bread to your table. From getting oil out of the ground to make fuel to getting ore out of the ground to make steel. All of those businesses have labor costs and travel costs and tax costs. And the only mechanism available for any business to pay any of its expenses is through price. So all of those costs end up in the price system. Those additional tax costs in our price system make us less than competitive in a global market, and it drives jobs offshore. These four problems, offshore money, the cost of compliance, the underground economy, and embedded tax cost in the price system, all remain in place when we nibble around the edges of the current tax code. They all go away by abolishing the code and taxing consumption rather than taxing income. The FAIRtax is a retail sales tax levied at the checkout counter on the purchase of new goods and services for personal use. There's no tax on used goods since nothing should be taxed more than once. There's no tax on business activity. There's no tax on personal income, corporate income, dividends, or estates. There's no gift tax, no capital gains tax, and no dividend tax. All of that is gone along with the IRS. Now, currently, the top 50% of income earners pay 97% of all income taxes. Their income tax averages 14.6% plus 15.3% for the payroll tax. Thus, the government takes 29.9% of everything you earn. Under the fair tax, you would give the government 23% of every dollar you spend. If you don't spend it, you're not taxed on it. By eliminating the IRS, we will share a $5 to $10 trillion 10-year benefit by getting rid of the compliance costs. Prices will decline because the embedded costs are gone. Take-home pay will increase since there'll be no deductions from your paycheck, and those two events will create a huge increase in purchasing power. We will become a global powerhouse by selling into a global economy with no tax component in our price system. So that no one should have to pay taxes on necessities, we devised a prebate system which would transfer to every household a distribution sufficient to totally untax them on necessities. Now, this is based not on income, but on the size of their household. The prebate for a family of 4 would be sufficient to allow that family to spend $39,400 a year with no tax consequences. Now, since the poor spend virtually all of their money on necessities, this will provide nearly complete relief from taxation for them. Beyond that, we're all voluntary spenders and we'll all be voluntary taxpayers. We'll pay taxes when we choose, as much as we choose, by how we choose to spend. The Fair Tax Bill anticipates the repeal of the 16th Amendment. The bill says that if we haven't repealed the 16th Amendment after 7 years under the fair tax system, the fair tax is repealed. If that happens, Congress will have to decide whether they want to vote to return to the system that is proven to be so corrupt, or repeal the 16th Amendment and keep the fair tax. We believe that the American people will put enough pressure on Congress to get them to repeal the 16th Amendment. The United States will turn to the fair tax one day. Not because Congress will suddenly be struck by the wisdom of it, but out of the realization that there's just no place else to go. Every tax increase in the last 60 years has been sold to the American people as only impacting the top 2%. And so the rest of America said, well, go get them. Those folks can afford to live elsewhere, and there's just not enough revenue there to meet our needs. The fair tax untaxes necessities, broadens the base, and lowers the tax rate. Everybody will be treated exactly the same. Under the fair tax, when Warren Buffett's wealth is spent, and it will be spent, if not by him, then by his heirs or his foundations, it will be taxed at exactly the same rate as his secretary's rate. And he ought to be proud about that. In conclusion, John's article clearly makes the case for why we need to enact the fair tax now. We now have the opportunity to force all members of the House to either vote for the present income payroll tax system or for the fair tax. They either support the corrupt income tax in the IRS or they want to get rid of it. It can't be any simpler than that. They either believe in being transparent and showing Americans the true cost of their government, or they don't. They either support the largest transfer of power from the government to the people, the fair tax, or they don't. If they think the fair tax needs to be changed, then they can propose that change. Don't condemn the entire bill because it has a flaw that can be easily addressed. And don't think for a minute there aren't any flaws in the income tax. Please stand with us and demand that your representatives support a much fairer, much simpler, and much more efficient way to fund the government, the fair tax. The fair tax does not pick winners and losers. Because it taxes spending, not earnings, the fair tax lets everyone save for their retirement tax-free. The fair tax collects the revenue the federal government needs to operate, but does it in a way that has the least impact on our individual freedom and the least impact on our economic prosperity. With a fair tax, there are no tax returns to file and no records to keep. We'll pay our federal taxes when we make retail purchases of new goods and services. And with a fair tax, there is no need for the IRS. If you sell a used couch or a used jet ski online, there is no fair tax due on that transaction. The fair tax will allow us to take back control. The income payroll tax system is broken, no longer working. We can't repair it, but we can replace it with the fair tax. Join us and take back control of our country and our lives, not with bullets, but with the elimination of one of the biggest threats to our liberty and economic prosperity, the income payroll tax. We should all remember Edmund Burke's warning that applies to our efforts to take back control. Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little. We should also remember this quote from George Orwell's 1984, which, if we do nothing, may foretell your and your children's future. If you want to picture the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. So what can each of us do? We can write letters and make calls to our elected representatives and attend Zoom town hall meetings demanding that if they really want to allow Americans to take back control, the first step is to eliminate the income payroll tax and enact the FAIRtax. Take back control. Help us pass the FAIRtax. The IRS will be gone and we'll pay our taxes when we make purchases. We, not the ruling class and their minions in D.C., will decide how much federal tax we pay, and we'll know how much tax we're paying because taxes will no longer be hidden from us. They'll be clearly shown on every retail receipt. If you have friends who don't know about the FAIRtax, send them to FAIRtax.org. Have them watch the whiteboards under how it works, and if they agree, ask them to please join us. Then, contact your members of Congress and the President and demand that Congress pass the FAIRtax, the only truly fair tax.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.